Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 13. So in the last two lectures, we've talked about a lot of different models for population growth. And I think it's easy to get the different models confused. So I'm going to begin today's lecture by sort of dividing our space of problems into the different areas where you use the different models. So again, the four models we've talked about are exponential growth, geometric growth, logistic growth, and Beverton-Holt. And so we use the exponential growth and geometric growth when we have no carrying capacity. So those are our primary colors. We've got red and blue. And again, in both cases, when the population is not limited by any kind of resource. So this could be a science fiction population like tribbles where there is no limit to population growth, or it could be a real population where you're at a very small population size, so none of the resources are limiting yet. So again, exponential growth and geometric growth are the equations we use when we have no carrying capacity. But whenever we have a carrying capacity, we use either logistic or Beverton-Holt. That's orange and green, the non-primary colors. So again, if you have a carrying capacity and your population is big enough that resources are starting to be limited, then you know you're in the realm of using logistic growth or Beverton-Holt. So that's one dichotomy, whether or not the carrying capacity matters, whether or not there is a carrying capacity, whether or not the carrying capacity is given in the problem, whether or not the population is large enough for the carrying capacity to matter. The other dichotomy is the type of breeding. So when you have continuous breeding, that's when you use the warm colors. You use exponential or logistic growth. So that's things like humans, mosquitoes, cockroaches, where they're just always breeding all the time. There's always newborns around at any time of the day, any time of the year. They're just always there. Discrete or seasonal breeding, I've used cool colors, so blue and green. That's when you use geometric or Beverton-Holt models. And these models assume that there's one breeding pulse per generation. So you're not breeding all the time. You're not breeding in December and January and February and March. So you can't talk about how the population's growing in those months because it's not growing. Nothing's happening. There's no births. All the births happen at one pulse, maybe in May during nesting season. So again, if you have a system where you have continuous breeding and no carrying capacity, then you are in the primary colors and warm colors, and so it's exponential growth. If you have a system where there is discrete breeding and no carrying capacity, you are in the primary colors and cool colors, so blue, geometric growth. If you have a system where there is a carrying capacity and continuous breeding, you are in warm colors and not primary colors, so that's logistic. And if you have a system where there's discrete breeding and a carrying capacity, that's your last option, Beverton-Holt. So that's how you decide which equation to use. And again, you have to memorize the equations for exponential and geometric growth, but on the exam, I will give you the equations for logistic and Beverton-Holt. All right, so those are the models we've so far used. If we take a step back and we ask more generally, what processes lead to changes in population size, we can really divide all the things that may cause a population to grow or shrink into four main categories. The first is births, the second is deaths, the third is immigration, animals coming in, just wandering into a population, and the fourth is emigration, animals wandering out and not coming back. All right, so if I have a closed system, that basically means there's like a wall around my population and nothing can come in or out. And so in that case, immigration and emigration don't happen. They're zero. And so the only things I have are births and deaths. And so the number of individuals I have 1 year later or one time point later is equal to the number I have right now, plus the number I added because of births, minus the number I lost because of deaths. And frequently we make the assumption that birth rate is proportional to population size. If I have more individuals, I'm going to have more babies. So if I have twice as many individuals in my population, I should get about twice as many babies. If I have half as many individuals in my population, I should get about half as many babies. And so we make this assumption, and to do that, we say that your birth rate, your total number of births, is equal to some constant birth rate times your population size, or the n sub t. All right. Frequently, we also say that deaths are proportional population size. If I have twice as many individuals in my population, chances are twice as many of them are going to die. If I have a small population with half as many individuals, chances are half as many are going to die. And so again, just like births, we frequently assume that deaths are proportional to population size, which means we can write that whole total number of deaths term as some constant times the number of individuals in the population. And so if I just sort of condense that down, what you'll notice is that I can write this equation, the number of individuals at some later time point, t plus 1, is going to equal 1 times the birth, or 1 plus the birth rate minus the death rate, all times the total number of individuals in my population at the current time. And if I just let those 1 plus b minus d equal a single constant, because they're all constants. One's sort of the number of babies per individual on average. One's the number of deaths per individual on average. If I just lump those all into a single constant and call that lambda, you can see that this gives exactly geometric growth. So really that lambda, that geometric growth rate, it's a summary of the number that were there at the current time, plus the number that were added because of births, minus the number that are lost because of deaths. It's just the 1 plus the birth rate minus the death rate. Now, if in an open system, it's a little more hairy. In an open system, I don't have a wall around my population. Things can come in and things can leave. And so in that case, my immigration rate and my emigration rate are no longer necessarily zero. In fact, they're typically non-zero. And in this case, we don't necessarily get a geometric growth equation. We only get geometric growth for sure in a closed system. If we add immigration and emigration, we have these terms that are no longer proportional to population size. Sometimes they're proportional to the area of the boundary around your population, or they're proportional to some other factor in the system. And once you do that, if the immigration and emigration rates are not proportional to your total population size, you cannot write the population change, this particular equation, as a geometric growth rate equation. You can only write a geometric growth rate equation when all the terms are proportional to population size. All right. So ultimately, this leads us to the idea of population dynamics, which is the ways in which populations change in abundance over time. Dynamics means things are changing. Population dynamics means populations are changing. And there's 4 main patterns of population growth. We've seen 2 of them already. The first is exponential growth. This is sort of what you see early on in a population, or in science fiction organisms like tribbles that just grow and rapidly expand in population size with no seeming limit. The next pattern of population growth we've also seen is logistic growth. And again, this is where the population grows rapidly at first, but then that growth rate slows down because resources become limited. So really, you might think that's where it ends. But there's a couple of other things that can happen, not so much when you just consider sort of births and deaths, but when you consider some other factors. So one is population fluctuations. This happens for a number of reasons, both internal to the population and external. We'll talk about that in a little bit in a few slides. But basically, population fluctuations are where you have these kind of wild swings in the population size. It's not kind of going up constantly at a rapid rate. It's not going up at a rapid rate and then slowing down. It's sort of just bouncing all over. That's a population fluctuation. The other thing you can have is population cycles. And this is a very special type of population fluctuation. It's regular. It's not kind of going up and down at random and you think, why is it, what's happening? Here you actually see, every certain number of years the population peaks and then it falls, and then it peaks and then it falls. And so that's a population cycle, which also happens in some systems. Now, importantly, these 4 major patterns of population growth are not independent. So you can have 2 of them together, and this is a good example. You see that the main trend in that teal-blue curve is logistic growth. We have some sort of rapid initial rise, and then the growth rate slows down, and the population kind of settles at about 100 individuals. but it's not doing it perfectly smoothly. You actually see a lot of bouncing around. That's not, the bouncing around is a smaller effect than the main trend in growth, but it's still happening. And so in this particular population, we have logistic growth, but we also have population fluctuations. And so having multiple different patterns occur at the same time is not unusual. All right, so if we think about the first pattern of growth, that's exponential growth. And if you remember right, there were two different equations for geometric growth, which gives you that rapidly expanding population with no limit in discrete time. And then we had one equation for exponential growth, which is sort of, again, that rapidly expanding population, but in continuous time. And again, in the previous class, we talked a little bit about how to relate the geometric growth rate and the exponential growth rate, and we came up with these equations. Again, these are things you either have to memorize or you have to know how to derive from the geometric growth rate equation and the exponential growth rate equation that you have already memorized. All right, but again, we said, no real population grows without limits. And so what's the point of studying exponential growth? You might wonder, why did Dr. Bewick introduce that other than to give us a problem on science fiction organisms like tribbles? Well, the fact is, populations can increase exponentially. They can increase like geometric growth if it's discrete breeding, or continuous growth if it's, or exponential growth if it's continuous breeding. They can do that for a period of time. They can do that when the population size is really small, and so none of the resources are particularly limited. So when does that happen? Well, it might happen if you have a native species that's kept in check by extreme events. And so you'll have sort of good conditions for a couple of years in a row, and the population will start to take off and grow exponentially, but then all of a sudden something terrible will happen, like a forest fire or 5 years of drought, and the population will get knocked back down again to a much lower level where resources, again, are not limiting. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of nesting spaces, there's plenty of everything, but again, some terrible environmental event has caused the population to crash. And then you'll have some good years in a row and the population will grow again like an exponential growth curve. And so that can go on and on and on forever in a system with a lot of disturbance where you're constantly knocking these populations back down to very small sizes where resources are not limiting. And so again, you get something that looks a lot like logistic growth. Another place where you'd see logistic growth in the real world is where you have species that are newly introduced to a region, and then you sort of have their population increase rapidly as they colonize this new area. So a good example is zebra mussels, what you see in that picture. And when they introduced them in 1998 to the Great Lakes, the population just rapidly took off because nothing was stopping them. They had all the resources they could imagine because there was only a few zebra mussels introduced in the lake, and everything that they needed to survive was in abundance. And so again, you have that rapid exponential growth. And so there's a couple of ways where new species can be introduced. Sometimes they'll disperse on their own. A good example is cattle egret. Those arrived in North America on some wind and they're here. And so when it's not aided by humans, we call that jump dispersal. It's a long distance dispersal that allows species to colonize a new geographic region. And typically when this happens, their population will exhibit that really rapid growth, that really rapid initial exponential growth. And again, it'll be exponential in continuous time. It'll be a geometric growth, kind of jumping up in little steps, but following that exponential growth trajectory if you have a population that breeds only once a year. The other way that you can have new species introduced that then exhibit exponential growth is because we help them. And if you look at these pictures, you'll see that there's a lot more organisms we have helped into North America than that have dispersed on their own. So we've helped zebra mussels, we've helped Aedes aegypti, we've helped fire ants, we've helped purple loosestrife, we've helped wild boar, and the list goes on and on and on. This is just a small fragment, a small fraction of the number of organisms we have helped to disperse to North America, and then these populations take off. There's nothing keeping them in check for quite a while. And so there's a lot of boar in the mountains, and actually in this area of South Carolina. Their population just explodes because they're newly introduced to the area. All right, but of course no population can increase forever, and once the population size gets big enough that a couple of resources become limiting, the organisms don't have enough to either survive or to have babies, then we get logistic growth. And again, we have those two different equations for logistic growth. We have Beverton-Holt, and we have logistic growth itself, which is the continuous version. Beverton-Holt is that discrete version where you're basically taking stepwise jumps along the logistic curve trajectory, but you're actually doing it in sort of stepwise disjunct steps because breeding all happens at once, and then you take a big jump in the population size, and then nothing happens for a pile of a year. And so you're kind of at a constant flat population, and then breeding happens again, and you jump up again. And again, just like with exponential and geometric growth, we learned how we can make Beverton-Holt and logistic growth be identical in terms of their trajectories by comparing or by picking the right big R naught and little r. And again, that relationship was very similar. It's just the exponential e to the power r is equal to your big R naught. And so logistic growth describes these populations that ultimately grow up really fast but then reach an equilibrium where the population size stops growing and they become relatively stable. And so logistic growth we use in general to describe populations that eventually level off because resources become limiting, and this is a good example. The red curve is your logistic growth, the blue curve is your exponential. And if you take a look at sort of just blow up that initial part, you can see that the exponential and logistic growth curves follow one another very, very closely when the population size is small, but then once the population size gets big enough, the exponential curve starts to deviate and ultimately ends up deviating substantially once you are sort of at a high population size near the carrying capacity. So how does that work? Last class, I showed you the differential equation for logistic growth, and we sort of went through this, but I'm going to go through it again. Basically, when I have a really, really small population size, then n is really small, and it's particularly small relative to the carrying capacity, k, and so n over k is a really, really small number, and that entire bracket ends up being approximately equal to 1. Well, if I stick that bracket in as 1, what you'll notice is you get the exact differential equation for exponential growth. So it makes sense that when the population is really, really small, you get something that looks a lot like exponential growth. But what happens in the other limit when the population is really, really big? Well, in this case, n is very large. In fact, it's almost as big as the carrying capacity itself, k, and so n over k is very close to 1, and 1 minus 1 is, of course, 0. And so if I do that, then my rate of change of my population size with time is 0. That means the population isn't changing in time, and so there's no growth. The population becomes fixed at a particular stable size. And so eventually, in most systems, exponential growth gives way to logistic growth. Again, unless the disturbance regime is really frequent so that that population keeps getting knocked down by environmental or abiotic factors, typically the population grows up until it can no longer, sort of the environment no longer supports it, and then you reach the carrying capacity and you get something that looks like logistic growth. All right, so those are the first two patterns of population growth. The next one is what we call population fluctuation. And this is rises and falls in population size over time. And so there's kind of two variants here. We have erratic population fluctuations where there's no real pattern. I look at this green curve and I have no real reason to know why it went up here or there or why it bounced around. That's sort of an erratic population fluctuation. You can also have sort of a bigger trend, something like logistic growth, but then you can have sort of these smaller fluctuations that change the trend a little bit. So they kind of add noise to the main trend. And so again, population fluctuations can be just wild swings in the population size, and that's the only pattern you see, or they can be smaller deviations from some other pattern, some bigger pattern in the population. So here's an example for spruce budworm, and what you see is that, 1 year we've got about 800, it bounces down to about, 300, it's back up to about 400, it's gained 400 a few years later, and basically there's no real pattern to that. We just have these sort of outbreaks, these explosions in the number of individuals at certain times for no good reason. It's kind of erratic. If I look at this, and I sort of squint really hard, it would be hard for me to predict when I'm going to have an outbreak of about 1,000 individuals, right? There's no rhyme or reason to that. The numbers just seem to go up and down at will at random. So that differs from population cycles, where we have sort of alternating periods of high and low abundance, just like we do in population fluctuations, but this time they occur at regular intervals. So the last example was spruce budworm. It's a type of forest pest that attacks trees. Another example of a forest pest that attacks trees is tent caterpillars, but unlike the budworm, what you'll notice is that the time between outbreaks is about the same all the time. And so, it doesn't take that much for me to look at this trend and say, hey, I'll bet the next time we're going to have an outbreak of forest tent caterpillar is 2011. 2010, 2011, because on average I seem to have an outbreak every 11 years. All right. So you might think population cycles are kind of weird. What causes these populations to go up and down on these long time scales, like 11 years? Well, it turns out there's a number of different causes. Some of them are responses to crowding, and there could be behavioral responses to crowding that drive these cycles. It might be predators, and particularly predator-prey cycles. These are common. These were basically some of the first cycles that were ever studied, particularly in lynx and hare. And people cared about that because fur trappers up in northern Canada were trying to catch hare to make, fur coats. And they noticed that some years the hare population was really high, and then other years it was just crashing. And they wanted to understand why, and eventually they linked it to the lynx population going up and down and sort of governing the size of the hare population. Similar thing to predators. You can get parasites causing these up and down cycles. It can also be driven from the bottom instead of top down. We have top down parasites and predators kind of forcing the cycle on the prey. But you can also have the food supply driving cycles. So, the food will be really available, and then the herbivore will eat it and get really big population, but then the food will be, overused and the herbivore population will crash. You can also get population cycling that's driven externally just by the weather. So things like decadal patterns. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about El Nino and La Nina years and all the different longer term cycles beyond seasonality that can affect your communities, your populations and communities. When it comes down to it, everything except for weather patterns, though, kind of has the same general reason behind why it causes population cycles. And that is that it results in what we call overcompensatory dynamics, and frequently it does this through delayed density dependence. But delayed density dependence is really just one way of getting what we call overcompensatory dynamics. All right, so what's overcompensatory dynamics? Well, really I can divide dynamics into two different categories: compensatory and overcompensatory. So with compensatory population dynamics, the population growth rate slows pretty early on, pretty quickly before the carrying capacity is reached. So, you're halfway to the carrying capacity and the population growth rate is already starting to slow down. And when that happens, it prevents the population from actually accidentally overshooting the carrying capacity. If your population growth rate is slowing down when you've got 50 individuals and you don't reach the carrying capacity until about 100, then you sort of slowly approach that carrying capacity and you sort of plateau when you hit it. And we see that type of population dynamics with the Beverton-Holt equation. And so if you actually plot the number of individuals at time t relative to the number of individuals at time t plus 1 for the Beverton-Holt equation, and I will let you do this, you can try this on your own, you can pick a value of k, pick a value of r naught, and make a plot like this. What you'll notice is that as you get larger and larger populations at time t, you also get larger and larger populations at time t plus 1. So if I put in 400 at time t, I'm going to get a bigger number at time t plus 1. Then if I put in 800, I'm going to get a smaller number, at time t plus 1. Then if I put in 800 at time t, and I'm going to get out a bigger number at time t plus 1. So basically that relationship between the number of individuals in the population now and the number in the future always increases. And what we say when this is true, we say that this is called a recursion relationship. A recursion relationship relates the number of individuals now to the number of individuals next year. When that is always increasing, we say that that recursion relationship is always increasing, and that's when we get compensatory dynamics. Now, the rate at which the recursion relation increases changes depending on population size. So when I have very, very few individuals at the current time, then I get a huge increase the next year, right? So that slope of that line is really big when I have very few individuals. And that's because you're getting something like a really rapid exponential type growth. Once I get a large number of individuals at the current time, then I get a very small sort of increase the next time period, right? And so basically it's that curve is always increasing, but the rate at which it's increasing slows down as I get to bigger and bigger population sizes. But it's always increasing. And so when you have a curve that looks like this, where it's just always increasing, you're going to get dynamics, you're going to get this slow approach to carrying capacity, and then the population is going to stop growing. You know the carrying capacity and exhibit crazy dynamics. You always just sort of get what looks like logistic growth. All right, different story when we have what we call overcompensatory dynamics. When we have overcompensatory dynamics, the population growth rate does not slow enough before you reach the carrying capacity, and so you accidentally, it's like running, and if you're running really, really fast, sometimes it's hard to stop yourself, and you kind of go beyond where you meant to, and then you kind of fall back, right? And that's what happens with overcompensatory dynamics. The population growth rate doesn't slow until you get really close to the carrying capacity, and so accidentally the population gets up above the carrying capacity and then crashes. And so this gives one of the ways we can model this is with an equation that's sort of like Beverton-Holt. It's a discrete equation, but it actually gives these overcompensatory dynamics. And the most famous example of that is what we call the Ricker equation, and it's right there. And just like logistic growth in Beverton-Holt, I will give you the Ricker equation on the exam. You'll need to know how to use it, but I will give it to you on the exam. Now, if I do the exact same thing and I plot the number at a particular time and then the number at the next time point, I sort of relate those two, with a Ricker equation, what you'll notice is that that curve doesn't always increase. That curve actually increases at low population size in the current time, but it decreases at high population size in the current time. And so it increases rapidly at low n, but then it decreases at high n, and that's what gives you these overcompensatory dynamics, that shooting over the carrying capacity and then decreasing, the population size actually decreases when you have a high population. When you have an equation like this, when you use the Ricker equation, you can get something that looks like logistic growth, but you can also get all these crazy dynamics, things like what we call damped oscillations, limit cycles, and even chaos. So here's the Ricker equation simulated when I have a fairly slow population growth rate, r equals 1. And in that case, the population growth rate's slow, and then as it gives you a chance, because the population isn't growing too fast, it gives you a chance for that population growth rate to slow down before you get to the carrying capacity. And so you get something that looks like logistic growth. Now, with a slightly bigger carrying capacity, you can kind of overshoot the carrying capacity a little bit. Sorry, with a slightly bigger growth rate, you can overshoot the carrying capacity a little bit, and it takes a little while before you settle into that fixed carrying capacity. So this gives what we call damped oscillations. This is where you have regular increases and decreases in the population size, but they're damped. They eventually die out, and you get that same stable equilibrium that you see in logistic growth. So for a slightly higher growth rate in the Ricker equation, we get damped oscillations instead of logistic growth. If we ramp that population growth rate up even higher, we get what we call a stable limit cycle. And so in this case, you overshoot, and then you kind of undershoot. And you overshoot, and you undershoot. And you overshoot, and you undershoot, and you kind of get trapped in this cycle of overshooting and undershooting and never quite reaching that happy point where you could stay forever. And so this gives you these regular increases and decreases in population size that will go on forever. They don't die out like you saw in the previous example. And then finally, the most interesting, when you have a really high population growth rate, you get chaos. In this case, you're not reliably overshooting and undershooting. You're just kind of bouncing all over. And that gives you this unpredictable pattern of highs and lows and something in between, and there's no repetition to it. You could have a high this year, and there's no real good way of predicting what's going to happen next year because it is chaotic. All right, so now we're going to do an example where we just show you how to use the Ricker equation to predict the number of individuals in the population for a couple of years. And again, we're just going to do that by applying that Ricker equation over and over. So again, if you aren't in class, I suggest that you try that yourself. Make sure you know how to do that kind of problem. If you don't, get notes from a friend, talk to me. All right. So a few slides back, I said that delayed density dependence is one way we really get these overcompensatory dynamics. We get this sort of crashing of the population because it overshoots the carrying capacity. And so delayed density dependence means that there's a time delay in the effective density on population size. So the population gets up really big before we have a chance for crowding to take effect, and that allows the population to overshoot the carrying capacity. Now, once we get caught up, once the time delay is over, we get caught up and the crowding starts being felt, then the population is in trouble and it actually crashes. And so this is one really common mechanism for generating overcompensatory dynamics. There are other mechanisms for generating overcompensatory dynamics, but delayed density dependence is one of the most common. And so there's a number of ways we can get this. One is if you have a predator population that responds slowly to prey numbers. So maybe the prey gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden the predator population catches up and causes it to crash. Another option is where the juvenile stage is limited, but adults aren't. And so this is a very famous example of sort of one of the first systems where overcompensatory dynamics were really studied in a controlled way. And the system is known as Nicholson's blowflies. And so Nicholson had this idea that you would get overcompensatory dynamics when you had this delay in the crowding effect. And he said, well, you know, if my juveniles are restricted, if they compete really strongly and resources are limited, but the adults aren't, then I can get really, really big populations of adults that lay tons and tons and tons of eggs, and the adults aren't really restricted, but then the eggs themselves don't do very well because they're competing with each other, and eventually, you know, I might have 1,000 adults that lay 1,000,000 eggs, but not 1,000 of them make it through, like 5 of them survive because there's so much competition. And so he had this idea that he could sort of tweak this system that has this delayed density dependence because adults are not regulated, whereas juveniles are, by altering which of the different stages was restricted. So he found that he was right when he restricted the juveniles but let the adults have whatever they wanted. That led to this delay in the effect of high adult densities. He had to wait a generation until the eggs were trying to sort of make it through and the larvae. And then he got sustained oscillations, very regular outbreaks of these flies and crashes in the population. But then he thought, well, you know what? If I don't have this delayed density dependence, if I actually make the juveniles and adults restricted so that, you know, when the juveniles get crowded, so do the adults, so I don't have to wait a generation until I get crowding, then I shouldn't have oscillations. And in fact, that's what he did. He restricted food for the adults and for the juveniles, and he found that he did not get oscillations. He got a stable population size. All right, so again, we have these different population cycles, and what you'll notice is that as we change the population growth rate, we moved from having logistic growth to damped oscillations to these sort of sustained oscillations or a limit cycle, and then to crazy, chaos. And in general, that's true. Faster growth rates make you more likely to overshoot your carrying capacity, and thus they make oscillations and chaos more likely. And again, it's like you running and trying to stop on a line. If you're going too fast, it's hard to stop on that line, and you frequently overshoot it. And that's the same thing these populations do. They get going really fast, and because that population growth rate is so fast, they overshoot the carrying capacity. Now, the other thing that causes you to overshoot the carrying capacity is having a longer time delay between the population reaching that carrying capacity or that critical size and then the negative effect of overcrowding being felt. And so if it takes, you know, if it's instantaneously, if you feel overcrowding the minute you get towards the carrying capacity, then your population slows down in time to not have oscillations. But if it takes a year or two and your, you know, population get really big and then the effects of density start causing death and killing and animals dying or not breeding, then you are more likely to get these oscillations. And if your delay is just a little bit too long, then you'll get damped oscillations. And if your delay is really long, you'll get sort of sustained oscillations or even chaos. And again, so it's exactly the same as just like when I increase my growth rate, I go from having a stable population size to damped oscillations to limit cycles to chaos. I can do the same thing by changing that time delay longer and longer and longer. I go from having a stable population to damped oscillations to sustained oscillations to chaos. All right, so that's a lot about how populations grow. But again, populations don't always grow. Populations can decline, and unfortunately, that means that populations can go extinct. And so there's a couple of different ways that populations can go extinct. Populations go extinct if they just in general do not make enough babies to replace the adults, right? And so this is going to be true when I have geometric growth with lambda is less than 1, and we've seen that before. Basically, if each adult is not having at least one baby on average in the next generation, then the population's crashing. Now, if you actually do that conversion between lambda and r, going from geometric to logistic growth, what you'll notice is that the threshold for a declining population in the exponential growth rate equation is r has to be less than 0. So again, for geometric growth rate, lambda has to be less than 1 for your population to decline. And then if lambda is bigger than 1, your population will grow. For exponential growth rate, little r has to be less than 0 for the population to decline. Little r has to be greater than 0 for the population to increase. But sometimes populations go extinct even if on average adults typically have more than one baby, right? And that's because stochastic events can cause the loss of entire populations, even when on average the growth rate for the population is bigger than 1. And this is particularly likely in small populations. And so I did a simulation of this effect. I made my lambda on average 1.05, but I let it vary. So, sometimes I have a little bit less than 1.05, and sometimes I have a little bit more than 1.05. On average, year after year, I had about 1.05. But what you'll notice is that 2 out of 10 of these populations went extinct just by chance, just because my population growth rate was fluctuating. And so this is actually a very well-known phenomenon. Populations that have variable growth rates, variable lambda or variable r, actually grow more slowly than you would expect based on their average value of lambda, their average population growth rate, or their average exponential growth rate. And in fact, the higher the stochasticity, the more your lambda or your little r is bouncing around and going all over the place, the slower your actual population will grow relative to what you would predict if you just averaged the growth rate over all the years and use that to predict your growth rate. And so you can see these different curves. On the left-hand side, I have a high stochasticity system. So my lambda is big, sometimes really small, but on average, it's in the middle. And what you'll see is that population grows very, very slowly. In fact, it doesn't grow anything like the red line, which is what you would expect based on averaging the population growth rate over many years. For low stochasticity, my sort of stochastic blue line follows the predicted exponential growth curve that you would get if you just averaged all the years, the growth rate. It follows it a lot better. Still not keeping up quite, but it's following it a lot better. And in fact, if I get rid of all my stochasticity and lambda is the same from one year to the next, then I follow that red line exactly. So again, the larger the variation in your population growth rate, the slower the population grows and the more you're likely to have extinction, even if you have, on average, the same population growth rate when you average it across many years. All right. So that's why stochasticity can be a little bit damaging and likely to cause populations to go extinct. And again, extinction in general is more likely in small populations. Now, it's not just because of these stochastic factors. There's a number of things that cause small populations to go extinct more likely. And really, we can divide these into 3 different broad categories that cause small populations to be really at risk of extinction. One is genetic factors. And we've talked a little bit about this before. Genetic drift and inbreeding can really hurt small populations. The next is demographic factors. And this is where some of that stochasticity comes in, we can talk about one particular kind of stochasticity, and that's demographic stochasticity. Frequently, this is then sort of exacerbated by Lee effects, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The final main class of sort of risks for extinction is what we call environmental factors. And again, we can have another type of stochasticity, another type of randomness that affects our population growth rate, this time what we call environmental stochasticity. And then, of course, we can also have natural catastrophes. Okay, let's go through each of these in a little more depth. So we've talked about genetic factors and how these can really hurt small populations and cause increased risk of extinction before. Again, genetic factors impact populations by stochasticity, by these chance events, these random happenings. And that's why they're primarily important in small populations. And there's four main effects. You can have allele fluctuations. Remember, we talked about how one allele can go up dramatically in relative abundance, or it can just go extinct just by chance. And as a result of that, because extinction is forever, we call it an absorbing state, nothing comes back from extinction, this causes reduction in genetic variation in these small populations. And the outcomes of this, like we've talked about in some previous classes, is that you can have these random increases in the frequency of harmful alleles, and you actually get increased differences between populations if they're separated. So here I've got a small population, and the idea of genetic drift is that there's these stochastic chance events that just happen to wipe out certain numbers in the population. And see here, the cow happened to step on the only 2 yellow flowers that were left, and then it walks on as if nothing happened, and now my population has lost yellow flowers. Now it's just got the red flowers. And if yellow was beneficial, too bad. Maybe yellow was great at attracting pollinators. It really did have a fitness advantage. Doesn't matter because Betsy stepped on them. Now, if I have a bigger population, of course, and Betsy steps on my 2 yellow flowers, doesn't matter because I've got a lot of other yellow flowers. And so these yellow flowers are going to do better because the pollinators are more attracted to them, even though Betsy stepped on 2 of them, right? And so again, in these large populations, you do not have genetic drift, that stochastic sort of random events killing your 1 or 2 good, or maybe it was your 1 or 2 bad, but there's no real, discerning between the good and the bad. Just some animals got killed, some plants got killed by random effects, and that altered your population frequency of the different alleles. Ultimately, this can lead to inbreeding and mating between related individuals. When I have sort of tiny populations, I can get these increases in these negative, harmful alleles. And then when I got these small populations and they're mating with each other, we get even worse of an effect because we get a lot of homozygotes where we have these bad alleles twice, and then we get sort of reduced reproductive success, lower birth rates, more birth defects, more death. And again, famous example is hemophilia in royal families. All right, so that's genetic effects. There's sort of stochasticity that leads to some alleles going up by chance, some alleles going down by chance, and this big allele frequency that then gets compounded by the fact that when I take these harmful alleles and let them we get inbreeding, then those animals are just not in good shape. So another thing that can really hurt small populations is demographic factors. And the first big one is, again, a form of randomness or chance events, what we call demographic stochasticity. And these are chance events related to individual survival and reproduction. So you can imagine if I have a bird who, on average, has about 2 eggs per nest, but sort of the number in each clutch varies randomly from 1 to 3. Well, if I only have 6 birds and basically 3 couples in my population, then there's a chance that, one of my birds' couples might have 1 egg, another might have 1 egg, and the third one might have 3 eggs. And in that case, I am not producing 6 new babies in this generation. In fact, I'm only producing 5, and so my birth rate's going to be less than 1. And that's because I only had 3 pairs, and just by chance, in that particular year, 2 of the pairs happened to have 1 egg and 1 had 3. I could have had the opposite scenario where 2 had 3 and 1 had 1 or 2, and I would have a higher than 1 birth rate, right? But again, when I get that sort of variation in birth rate, then I can't expect my population to grow at the same rate as I would if it was always the same population growth rate and the average across the all years. Now, if I have a large population of birds, some of the pairs are going to have 1 egg, some of the pairs are going to have 2 eggs, some of the pairs are going to have 3 eggs, but it's highly unlikely that all the pairs are going to have 1 egg or all the pairs are going to have 3 eggs. And so you're much more likely to get the average per generation growth rate in this population because I have so many breeding that I'm just more likely to, not have them all be on the small end or all be on the big end. And so in small populations, I'm likely to see demographic stochasticity that causes my per generation growth rate to bounce all over the place. And of course, we know that that depresses the overall rate of population growth. In a bigger population, I'm more likely to always have the same growth rate from one year to the next because I've just got more birds, so my average ends up being less sort of susceptible to these random events. And so again, we don't have that same depression in the population growth rate as a result of that stochasticity. And so demographic stochasticity occurs when we have random chance in birth and death rates that cause some years to have lambda less than 1. And if you have enough of these years in a row, you can actually get extinction, even if on average the population should be growing at a rate fast enough to prevent extinction. All right. One thing that really contributes to or exacerbates the problem with demographic stochasticity in small populations is that sometimes when I have demographic stochasticity, I end up with a couple years where my per generation growth rate is less than 1, the population starts declining a bit, and it crosses a threshold. And it crosses a threshold for the Ali effect where the population is now small enough that the population growth rates actually start to decline. And so in this case, this is something like we saw before. When I have very few butterflies, maybe they have trouble finding mates. And so for 4 butterflies, I only get 2 mated pairs, and so 4 babies. Whereas if I have a much bigger population, they don't have much trouble finding each other. And for 6 butterflies, I get a lot more babies. And so again, you can sort of compound the problem. Demographic stochasticity can push your population to a small size, depress that overall growth rate, and then once you've had those chance events, a couple of bad years, push you to a small size, then the elite effect takes over and now you're in really big trouble because a couple of good years can't rescue you because sort of those group effects that you relied on to have a positive growth rate have been lost. So again, elite effects cause very small populations to do poorly. They're frequently related to behavior, something like mate finding or group behavior, maybe protection in groups, protection from predators. And so people think that this might be what happened to the passenger pigeons. Basically, they got hunted down to a low level, and then once they got to a really low level, these tend to be very social birds flying in large flocks, and that protected them from predators because the predator couldn't take the whole flock. But once the population got small enough, they weren't really protected from predators. There were, 4 or 5 birds in a flock, and so the predator could just have at it. And so that sort of exacerbated the problem and pushed them into ultimate extinction. All right, so that's demographic factors. The final factor that can cause extinction is, again, a form of stochasticity, but this time environmental stochasticity. So these are erratic or unpredictable changes in the environment. And so maybe I have a tree and it's growing, and every year the population doubles. There we go, doubling. But then I get a couple of bad years. Maybe rain is not great for these trees. And so, I get a bad year. It doesn't kill any tree directly, but, it increases the death rate a bit for a couple of years in a row. And then, maybe the rain goes away and we have a couple of good years, and so the population can grow double. But then the rain comes back the year after, and oops, well, we had enough years of sort of rainy, kind of moist, non-sunny environments, and just by chance they happened consecutively enough to wipe the population out. And so this is an example where environmental stochasticity causes extinction just because the number of rainy years we had in a row was too much for that small population to sustain. Now you might wonder, well, how does this environmental stochasticity differ from demographic stochasticity? With demographic stochasticity, it was more about, the number of babies that the bird happened to have. Whereas with environmental stochasticity, it's not like this bird happened to have 1 and that bird happened to have 1, but what was happening to the 2 birds was completely unrelated. It was just sort of it laid a clutch with one, this laid a clutch with one, and this other one laid a clutch with three, and just by chance, two of them had one. That's demographic stochasticity. With environmental stochasticity, the entire population is affected at once because those rainy conditions are kind of bad for everybody. It's not sort of one bird having a nest of one has nothing to do with the other bird having a nest of one. It just happened. In this case, one bird having a nest of one because the conditions were really dry, and the other bird having a nest of one because the conditions were really dry. Those are correlated. Those are related to each other. They're related through that environment affecting both birds, right? And so with environmental stochasticity, the whole population is affected at once, but from year to year, the population is affected differently. If I have a rainy year, it may be bad. If I have a nice sunny year, it might be good. And the rainy and sunny years kind of come at random. Something even worse, we can also have natural catastrophes. This isn't so much, a kind of crappy year causing a lower birth rate or a higher death rate. This is sort of one single event catastrophically affecting the population. So here I have my tree population growing, and we saw this before. We have a hurricane come in and just wipe it out. And in a small population, that's sort of geographically in a very small region, a single event like a hurricane or a fire can wipe out every individual in that population. And so in this case, environmental stochasticity and natural catastrophes can actually endanger these small populations. And again, if they're all in the same place, it's even more likely because environmental stochasticity is sort of these bad, kind of crappy, maybe not terrible hurricanes or tornadoes, but they're just not good for growth years. But they probably only happen over one area in space. And so if I've got this population in Nebraska and in Maine and in Florida, even if there's not a lot of them, then what's the chance of the rain being bad in Nebraska and Maine and Florida all in the same year? Not much, right? And so those populations might survive even though I have a bad year. But if they're all living in Nebraska in one tiny mountain range, then, or prairie range, I guess there's not a lot of mountains in Nebraska, then, the environment being bad in that little area for a couple of years can really hurt the population. So this brings us to the idea of metapopulations. Like I said, if I have sort of populations in three different areas, if one of them happens to go extinct because of a catastrophe, some kind of hurricane or a tornado, or a pile of bad years in a row, maybe that doesn't kill everybody directly, but just causes lower birth rates so that my per generation growth rate is less than 1 and can't keep the population up, well, that's okay because, maybe I lost my Nebraska population, but if I'm trying to manage this, I can take some individuals from Maine and move them back to Nebraska and say, okay, now you're okay, we've still got you, grow in the next couple of good years. This is the idea of metapopulations, except for people aren't actively taking them. Their individuals are dispersing. And so if I have a pile of different regions that are sort of distant from each other, where the populations all exist, but they're linked by small amounts of dispersal, then metapopulations can actually allow species to persist much better than a single habitat patch. And so there's a couple of different ideas of metapopulations. Basically, we have source populations that send more immigrants than they receive. And so they're basically allowing colonists to go to these areas that may be not so good. Those areas that are not good are what we call sink populations. So they receive more immigrants than they send. And what's a source population and a sink population can actually vary from one year to the other. So the source population may have really good environmental conditions for a couple of years in a row, and it keeps sending individuals to these sink populations where the environment may have been a little crappy for a couple of years in a row. But then when the conditions switch, maybe the sink populations end up having good conditions for a couple of years and they become the source, and then the ones that used to be the source end up having bad conditions for a couple of years and they become the sink. And so that idea that these populations are busy sending individuals from one to the other, that can allow you to have sort of what we call a rescue effect, where immigration actually protects a population from extinction by reducing that problem with small populations. Each little local population in this metapopulation is small, but because they are sort of connected by dispersal, then you can actually have the populations persist and do a lot better than you would otherwise because of this sort of connectivity. All right, so that is our final class on population dynamics. And again, if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to email me and we can talk about that. Otherwise, I will see you next class.